and thank you everyone for attending in person and to all of our online audience. We're here in this event, host Decolonization. I'll start the introductions, even though our in-person discussants have not all arrived yet, but they'll be here. They're just running from class. So I'll present Dr. Alan Covey, who is a professor of anthropology here at UT. He has conducted archaeological and archival research in the Andes since 1996, focusing on the Inca Empire and early colonial Peru. This
is a big entrance for you. She was introducing you, so a round of applause. You should sit there, so yeah. By there, so people can see you.
So as you can see, he's just now arriving, and his most recent book is Inca Apocalypse, published with Oxford University Press in 2020, and was a finalist for the Prose Award in World History, as well as the UT's Hamilton Book Award.
It's an extraordinary book. So yes.
Great. And then with us is Dr. Lina Castillo. She's an associate professor here in the Department of History. Her book, Crafting a Republic for the New World, Scientific, Geographic, and Historiographic Inventions of Colombia, was published in 2018 by the University of Nebraska Press. And she's currently at work on her second book project, Colombia's Paper Empire, Cosmopolitanism, Print Culture, and Geopolitics in the Age of Revolutions. And then the next commenter will be Dr. Megan Raby. She will be here with us too. She's a historian of science and environment whose work emphasizes the transnational connections of science in US and Latin America. Her book, American Tropics, The Caribbean Roots of Biodiversity Science, was awarded the 2019 Philip J. Foley Prize by the History of Science Society. And finally, our last discussant would be Dr. Luis Cárcamo Huechante. He's a founding member of the Comunidad de Historia Mapuche, as the CB admits Senior Centennial Chair in United States Mexico's relations here at UT Austin. He's the author of Acoustic Colonialism, Mediations, Disfigurement, and Mapuche Interferences, and Tramas del Mercado, Imaginación Económica, Cultura Pública y Literatura en el Chile a finales del siglo XX. And the author of the book some of you received, and the article you all read, is Dr. Christopher Heaney. He's an assistant professor in the Department of History at Penn State University, the author of Cradle of Gold, the story of Hiram Bingham, a real-life Indiana Jones and the search for Machu Picchu, was translated in Spanish and published in Peru in 2012. He's currently at work on 2 monographs, both informed by research in museums and archives in Peru, US, the UK, and Spain. It's called Empire of the Dead, Inca Mummies, and the Origins of American Anthropology, forthcoming with Oxford University Press, and Grave Openings, a history of the colonial laws regulating grave robbing in the Anglo-Iberian Atlantic world and their assault upon indigenous sovereignty. Thank you for being with us, Dr. Heaney.
Thank you so much, Diana, for the introduction, and thank you, Jorge, for the invitation. It's been about 7 years since I've been back in Austin, and the plan was originally not to come back for a professional reason. But when Jorge asks, I follow. But it was a real honor, and although this is a subject that I can't say that I have a lot of pleasure presenting on because of the subject matter. It's one that when I'm asked to present on, I think it's very important to do, and I appreciate you all coming to be here and getting to share the table and a room with many of the people who really profoundly shaped this article and the project. Jorge and my other co-advisor, Seth Garfield, I'm excited to be here today. Eric Kusumek, Bruce Hunt, and Megan Raby have given me several chances to work through the arguments on Samuel George Morton over the years. I really appreciate Professor Cárcamo Huechante for coming, and Lina del Castillo for shaping how I think about the early intellectuals of the Peruvian Republic. And what I'll be presenting and what you've read for today is an essay that came out at the end of last year, but really previewed some of the larger arguments of the book. And so your feedback and your commentary is very important to me as I do this. Again, this is a hard subject. It's one that I had very little pleasure in researching and writing it. but it's not a subject about trying to find pleasure or pride, but trying to account for a process whose outcome for its primary actors, Andean ancestors, would have represented a profound loss for them if they knew what had happened. It's also about responsibility to how our fields, history and anthropology, have constituted themselves with the history and bodies of others. I'm not Andean or Peruvian. I am, however, a North American who for the last 20 years has benefited from Andean scholarship, from friends, from mentors. And for even longer, I've been in and out of museums that have in part made themselves from the Andean dead. In other words, I'm an interested party, as might be many of you. And so talking about that history when asked feels fairly necessary. So I'm going to summarize the argument of the piece for you. As you know, the article tries to explain why American anthropological actors and museums like the Smithsonian collected more human remains from the Andes than any other single group through about 1920. I argue they did so because they were initially seeking to adapt an earlier colonial and early Republican Peruvian pattern of looting and studying and displaying Inca and Andean ancestors. That pattern or tradition had begun in the 16th century, and it left an intellectual legacy in the Atlantic world that by the late 18th century had set up the ancient Peruvians, in quotes, as the America's oldest observable human remains, and possibly their most, again in quotes, civilized ones, by dint of their association with the Incas and mummification. With independence, Peruvian Creoles made Andean or Inca mummies the country's first scientific object. Jose de San Martin, the Patriots announced Peruvian independence or opened the door to diplomatic recognition to Great Britain by sending the British English king a Inca mummy for the British Museum. Mariano Eduardo de Rivero, whom Nina has studied as well, written about as well. When he opened Peru's first national museum, there was an Inca mummy in every corner of the museum. Thinking about how these acts shaped scholarship in the wider Americas and the Atlantic world in this moment, I think takes seriously the intellectual production of the Incas and Spanish America, while also linking it to the colonial processes like grave robbing and grave opening that I argue deepened those patterns within the United States. The heart of the essay shows how the Philadelphia craniologist Samuel George Morton used Andean human remains as his prime comparative group in his collection, his largest population and the population that he spent the most pages on in his work, Crania Americana. I argue that his doing so decisively and not just by happenstance changed the terms of what became anthropology, from studying individual types, a Seminole, a African, to making larger and larger collections of groups whose numbers could be measured and averaged together, and that could be then used to make historical arguments regarding racial hierarchies and difference as going backwards in time. His initial celebration of the indigenous Peruvians, not something we associate with Samuel George Morton, also provoked a highly racist and racialized reaction from one of his patrons, the chronologist George Kuhn, which led Morton to retract and reinterpret his work to showing essentially the reverse of what he was initially arguing, that the ancient Peruvians were not so developed as he originally thought, and that all Native Americans were basically the same and as supposedly doomed, again in quotes, as the Incas. Not everyone in participating in this sort of scholarship in the Atlantic world and Peru agreed with Morton, especially in Peru, where his presumptions of having collected Inca remains was ridiculed, as well as his claimed connection between skull size and intelligence. But engaging with his arguments, I argue, shifted anthropology's terms. He had shown utility, or at least the argumentative utility, of using larger racial sets. This is sort of a statistical argument that we can sort of see in the larger history of statistics and science in the 19th century, how it shaped the way people approach things. And so his supporters and opponents, in order to either contest him or support him, began to build larger and larger collections as well, no longer sufficing with a few examples, but trying to replicate, I argue, the numbers that Morton was able to attain with the ancient Peruvians. They were able to do so because of expanding American settler colonialism, and it led to the increased collection of indigenous North American remains as well, I would argue. This isn't to say that violence towards the indigenous dead wasn't already happening, it was, but I think these two things become entangled and magnify each other through this process. The Andean dead remains the largest collection in Morton, though, and in many other of these early collections, both because of their academic pedigree, the number of arguments and amount of scholarship published on them in the first 20 years or so, and also because they were believed to be uniquely accessible on Peru's coast, where Peruvians of many backgrounds, including Indigenous, dug them up. The long-term effects of this, and this is the framing device of the article, is the huge numbers of ancient Peruvian remains in the Smithsonian and other museums, their presence in a fairly blockbuster fashion at the Chicago World's Fair, the first American PhD, first American to get his PhD in anthropology, wrote his dissertation at Harvard on the Andean dead. So one of the things that this paper is trying to think about is like why, given these foundations, this process has either been forgotten or dismissed as sort of epiphenomenal to the history of anthropology, why it's been thought about as coincidental or less important than perhaps the either the US intellectual history of how anthropologists develop their theories in the field, or focusing fairly essentially on US settler colonialism in the United States, rather than thinking about these other imperial dimensions. I think this argument asks us to think about the non-US origins of American anthropology and similar practices of violence in science. The need to attend to, in this case, an entanglement with the Andes in Peru that is not just context to US history, but in part determinative of it, even if it's later forgotten. The remains of these entanglements, in this case, are still with us in the Andean remains, the human remains that have not been returned or repatriated in any sense or any level approaching that of Native North Americans. The last part of the essay explores that connection, treating this as less of a comparison than as a link. As we know, a great many museums in the United States have dragged their heels on repatriating Indigenous American remains, or more recently, the remains of Black Americans. I don't come out and say this exactly in the article, but it might be offered that when you have a core population that is not touched by the law, it maybe makes the rest of the law easier to swallow for museums. If your largest population is staying in place, you know that even with the repatriation of another group, that there is a quote unquote study collection. And anthropologists training in bioanthropology in the DC area, for example, a great many to do their first project on the remains in the Smithsonian, the Peruvian remains there. I think thinking about how this connects to Peruvian history is important. When we think about decolonization along the lines of national histories, however critical, we also sometimes neglect imperial history and the histories of other American republics entangled with that of the US. Really attending to those histories means understanding how their trajectories follow their own course and respond to their entanglement with that of the US in unexpected ways. The larger book, of which Skull Walls is ultimately just one chapter kind of spread out, shows how Peruvian museums and anthropology projects began by celebrating Inca and Andean remains as sovereign ancestors of the nation. And here I'm definitely following a line of the work of Mark Turner, Rebecca Earle, Natalia Marlouf, and Stephanie Ganger. But it also shows us how those whom we might expect to be in opposition to that pattern or resisting it sometimes did so, but also sometimes participated. The native Andean peoples who find themselves having to occupy more complicated positions in relationship to ancestors. As Jorge Ceballos Quiñones, Susan Ramirez, even Rocio Gomez Delibes have shown, Andean peoples have been coerced to participate in grave opening in Huaqueo, the opening of Huacas since the 16th century. By the 17th, 18th century, they were also doing so to retain some of the wealth that would have otherwise been lost to Spanish colonists, sort of claiming that this is actually their ancestors' wealth, so they are going to dig it up first. And by the 19th century, I think we see that tendency existing alongside efforts to continue to honor ancestors in the highlands, I found evidence in the 19th century of communities returning or at least continuing to bring out mummified ancestors to engage with climates. On the coast, though, you see grave opening happening at a lot of levels of society. White Creoles, but also people who read from the outside read as Indian. Whether they actually consider themselves that or not is another question. But I would propose that it was a way of engaging with Andean history and laying claim to it, whether or not it was looting or engaging with the ancestors in a more sort of quote unquote typical sense. My book ends with Julio Tello, the Peruvian archaeologist who reconciles a lot of these positions. And his work also leads to a pretty crucial piece for understanding where one of the places I end up in the article, which is the Peruvian state in 1929 claiming ownership of Andean remains, human remains. Not something they always exercise, but that is in the background for thinking through questions of the future of remains in museums. And it's something that professionals in museums and professionals in museums in Peru think about, is that repatriations tend to happen through the Peruvian state. And the Peruvian state has in Peru refused to give back some ancestral remains like Juanita, the mummified Capacocha, in Arequipa, refused to give back those remains to the community that has tried to claim them, saying that they don't have adequate museum spaces. And also, as sort of the end of the article, as you read, I engaged with Marisol de la Cadena's incredible passage from Earth Beings, in which she talks about how what the National Museum of the American Indian saw as a repatriation of an ancestor was received by community as reburying Suka, a dangerous being from another time that was not seen as sort of biologically or ancestral to that particular group, but had to be taken care of nonetheless. Thinking about like the ambiguities here is very much where I want us to end up, and where I'm still learning and making mistakes, I think. And you know, it's possible to get too subtle, too nuanced with this. But I think it's something that hopefully in the process of bringing this work out and thinking about how it is going to come out in the book requires a lot of conversations and a lot of hearing of different perspectives of what necessarily could be done, or I try to avoid the words should be done, because it's not, I don't feel that it's my place at all to make recommendations on the arcs of these things, but instead provide the information so that it's useful and is not just sort of cloistered in museums and their archives the way they've been for a long time. I'll leave it there. I initially planned to talk through how the project has changed from when I first started researching it in 2010. That's what I know is a long time ago, and how it changed through the process of revision, but I can talk about that and follow up. I'm far more interested in your reactions to it, and I thank you for the commentary that you're about to give and the questions that might come in through the chat as well. It's exciting. It's always a little scary to be presenting on something as heavy as this, and for whom I know that some of us listening to it will see themselves in the story in a way that is very personal in terms of their own ancestry or family members. And but again, as I said, this is a part of the history of history in the United States, and how the history in the United States has sort of constituted itself in the 19th century by taking histories of places and peoples and bodies of places like Peru as precedent to the history of the US Republic. And so I think hopefully it's something that we should all feel invested in. And thank you very much for this chance to sort of frame things.
Thank you. Thank you. Alan is here, so he'll get going.
Yeah, I'll start with thanks to Jorge for setting this up and inviting me, and to Chris for the chance to engage with your scholarship. also apologize. I have to run to a 1 o'clock class, so I'm going to miss especially Luis's commentary, which I think will be a real counterpoint to some of what I'll say. So I'm an anthropological archaeologist, and as we're the field of non-Western peoples, as Eric Wolf has described them as people without history. And as an archaeologist, also, as we're talking about positionality, I represent, I think, the past of archaeology in terms of my demographics, rather than where the field is trying to get to. And so this is a really interesting moment. So as an archaeologist, we do the prehistory of human antiquity, and we have that cobbler's children running around barefoot sort of thing, which is that we don't have a good sense of our own history. And there's something really valuable in the work that Chris is doing to force us, those of us who will read this, and I hope people will read this, but force anthropologists and archaeologists to reconsider who our ancestors are. And this is something that in Frank Salomon's work, where he is working with people and asking about burial monuments and ancient dead, and hearing the local indigenous people say, these aren't our ancestors, these are the Gentiles. American archaeology and anthropology has Gentile ancestors like Samuel Morton that we don't want to claim. We want to have good ancestors. And as we're finding that our good ancestors, like Franz Boas, ran the stomatology building at the Chicago Columbian Exposition in 1893, we don't have a clean moment where we became the good guys. And I think that's something that having a history where we can't just throw in, well, yeah, Thomas Jefferson was the first American archaeologist to say, and so this is, I think, a necessary history for anthropology and for archaeology. And something that I think is really important in this article is not just linking the early disturbance of Indigenous dead to the 19th century, but also grounding this relentless collection by our good ancestors. So Hiram Bingham, where they were doing anthropometry and eugenics-based work, and that's why they were also collecting skulls around Machu Picchu. And there's a figure that I think is worth thinking about, that at 1920, where Chris finishes the paper, the US Census counted 250,000 Native Americans in the US, and US museums held almost that number of Indigenous bodies. There's a convergence there that American anthropology and archaeology came of age as a discipline in a period from the 1870s to the 1930s, where the United States government denied the sovereignty and really existence of tribal governments, declared Indigenous people in North America and in the United States to be property and patrimony. And so I think that this is incredibly valuable to get that history. And so the thought that kind of came out of many thoughts that came out of this paper is the colonization of Native American bodies is a twofold process. So the Spanish are coming in and saying, we want Native bodies for work. We will disturb Native bodies to get treasure that lies with them. We want Native body, the dead, to be buried in certain ways, and as a way of disciplining. And that sort of body discipline was racialized, and it was tied to a project of flattening the diversity of the Andes out into making all of these different groups and peoples and languages into Indians, into Christian subject Indians. And so some of this process, the success of that process of severing people from their ancestral dead and from a sovereign identity or a specific political or ethnic identity, that's maybe a legacy of that early period. And so jumping across that, by the time we get to the Enlightenment, there is still this question of the Incas, of Europeans saying, well, we understand that Indians are inferior to Europeans, but how could you have an inferior race produce a Manco Capac who could create laws and people that could make these buildings and these bridges? And I think Chris does a nice job of getting that discourse of the time of saying, well, for some people, they said, well, it's because the Incas were a separate race. They civilized themselves. They appeared in Lake Titicaca and took over the Andes. They were the first settler colonialists, I think, as Chris is making a point for some of the writers of that time. And their disappearance creates a space for other settler colonialists to continue the job of fighting racial degeneration. And these are ugly, ugly, ugly terms from that time that I think to repeat that is I think to have to repeat that is unpleasant. And so the first phase of colonialism, but then I think there's a second phase, which is the scientific colonization of Andean bodies. And I think that's where this 19th century collection, that to have an American anthropology, to have an Americanist archaeology in the United States required material. It required samples and collections. To build museums meant to fill them with things. And so going out and trying to do that at a time that we could say that the political decolonization of South America was underway, that there's a second wave of colonizing native bodies in the Andes. And to kind of wrap up quickly, because there's so much I wish I could sit around and talk with everyone here about in much more detail. I think decolonization is a multi-stage process. So the political part of that could be done by people that are also participating in the scientific colonization of the Andes, and what Margarita Wyla, the linguistic anthropologist, calls racialized fractalization, where coastal people are still building this idea of highland people as being less than. People in the cities are building an identity of being greater than people in the countryside. People in Peru are pointing to their ethnic identity as being superior to people in Bolivia. And so these are things that are still unfolding. In my field, decolonization has been underway in our institutions because Native American activism and civil rights movements in the 1960s and 1970s forced that onto the agenda. And so that's something that the NAGPRA law of 1990, which drives a lot of what's going on in North America, the law that created the National Museum of the American Indian, all of that came out of a generation of Native American activists, especially Native American youth that grew up in US cities and that actually found a common bond in their worldview and religious identities. And so this resurgence of Native American religion made repatriation inevitable. And so that's something that the first waves of repatriation from North American context, and I've worked in museums that have huge collections and came up through graduate school during the foot dragging and the pushback of academic professionals that created a profession and a sense of community that was very exclusionary. That said, we mostly white men with PhDs, are the ones to curate these things. This is patrimony for humanity, for science. This is our stuff, and we don't want to give it back. These are things that some people in the field still lay claim to, with false narratives of science giving way to religion or to creationism, which still I think resonates through some of the professional organizations. And so for the questions of the future, I think that as an archaeologist, one of the questions is, because the second wave of decolonization is just beginning, I think, in the Andes. And the question is, what will it develop into? So archaeologists today, I think, have a more pronounced sense of trying to work with communities, but asking the question, what is the community? There isn't the sort of sovereignty and tribal identity that drives Native American politics in the US. So the question of, if you go into a rural community or an urban setting, there's going to be expecting that there are going to be a lot of different opinions and identities, and expecting that it won't always be an inevitable conversation. But I think there are more archaeologists today that are committed to, first of all, acknowledging that we come from a field that hasn't done the right thing, and that we aren't. I think I appreciate Chris's position. We're not the people to drive the question of repair, but trying to listen and sometimes hear things that here that we don't know enough, here that we have blind spots. And then another question for this is, having worked in several communities where people didn't express a very strong connection to the dead that would incidentally appear in our excavations, I think there are archaeologists that say that doesn't matter. And yet we have to ask the question, might Indigenous Andean people recover a sense of ancestral identity and a more active shared vision for repatriation? That's what happened in North America in the 1960s and 1970s. From the margins, all these different tribal identities came together around the shared sense that these bodies are sacred and powerful and dangerous, and that their appropriate resting place isn't in a museum or a university collection. And so I would say the door is open, and that also means that practitioners like myself need to be prepared to constantly to listen to the ways that we need to adjust our ethics and our practices. That there may be things that are okay to the Peruvian state from the patrimonial claims that it's made. They may be legally okay, but they're not necessarily ethically okay now. And even if they were, if they may be ethically unquestioned now, and in the future they might not be. So that's my hope as I train students that come, I think, come to these questions in a much healthier place. That question of how we can be a part of where Indigenous Andeans want to take this in the future.
Thank you.
Well, again, I'd like to thank Jorge Cañizares' Guerra and everybody with the IHS, of course, for the opportunity to be here, and especially for the opportunity to comment on Chris's evocative and haunting work. It's a difficult read for sure, and I'm also thankful for it. And I'll begin by summarizing some of the arguments and contributions of Chris's article that I found most compelling, and sprinkled within these highlights from the article are some comments and questions for Chris that are coming from my own interest in 19th century Republican sciences in Latin America, especially Colombia, but I'm also especially interested in some of the comments that Alan was making and that you were also noting in your introductory comments is kind of what the implications are in terms of the ethics of doing, the ethics of what happens with these time travelers that are these Andean remains that have been displaced so many times and in different ways, and not just displaced in terms of place, but of temporality too, because a lot of their specific origins have been erased during this period. And so it's kind of, it's incredibly difficult. And that's something you signal in the paper as well about how difficult it is to be able to even identify what communities would most, or where the communities' origins are, especially in these contexts of displacement. And so it's something that of course the article begins with, and that we haven't explicitly talked about so much yet in the comments, are the 160 skulls that were attributed to the Peruvian Indians that greeted the visitors to the Smithsonian's first hall of physical anthropology in 1965. And Chris notes how indiscernible brackets fixed the skulls to the wall in the shape of a lopsided mushroom cloud. And the imagery, of course, is evocative of the nuclear age that also was ushered in by the United States, along with the exhibits underscoring of the space age, which supposedly was the culmination of the US-centered events that were humanities universals, supposedly by the Smithsonian. The anthropologists behind the making of the wall seem to be aware of the composition's effect, stating how the arrangement was intended to help visitors visualize how, quote, the world's human population has literally exploded in historic times. So the violence of the imagery also is kind of evocative, not just of the space age, but of the nuclear age, and just completely not being in any way apologetic or forthcoming about this is the imagery that they're putting on the wall. And so Heaney sets out to help us better visualize and discern those indiscernible brackets that come to fix Peruvian skulls, not just to the Smithsonian's wall, but also to the anthropological, historiographical, and cultural walls built in the United States with Latin American materials in ways that elided Latin American, Indigenous, and Spanish imperial knowledge, broadly speaking, about those same materials. And so it's the violence of the erasure of the individuals whose remains these are, the violence of displacing them, but then also the violence of like all the accumulated knowledges that had gone into their arrival into the Smithsonian itself, right? So there's several levels of violence and elisions and erasures. By the time the Smithsonian's building the Skull in 1965, of course, the individual identity of the human remains used to build it had suffered that double erasure. The distant time and space of ancient Peru categorized this vast collection of remains, and American anthropologists, in using this category, elided the vast expanse of time and geography that separated these individual remains. And the use of the category also elided how these harvested human remains contributed to a shared and still colonizing Republican present. And I think Chris is able to bring this argument out very well through the paper. And of course, by the late 20th century, these time-traveling Andean remains suffered yet another erasure. Neither their origins nor their ancientness mattered anymore. That history explained why there were so many of them in the Smithsonian collections, but by the 1960s, that history was less important than the effort to make them serve as stand-ins for a universal, albeit US-centered history of human population growth as reigning supreme, which of course with the irony of kind of this thinking about Peruvian, this is I'm thinking about Mark Thurner's work, of course, about how Peruvians could stand in for universals. So there are these very many layers of universals that are being applied in terms of thinking with these remains and through their violent displays. Although journalists at the time did question why the Smithsonian used ancient Peruvian skulls as visual symbols for man's numerical supremacy, the director, Dale T. Stewart, simply explained to the journalists that they used the skulls because they had so many of them, and that was it. And so that, kind of underscores that violence. Chris offers a more nuanced answer than Stewart, of course, and that question is more intriguing, is why would human remains of Andean origin make up more American anthropological collections than any other single population? And so by identifying the entangled historical roots, and he uses this methodology of entanglement in order to kind of open up not just this material skull wall, but also kind of these academic skull walls that are still with us in so many ways. And he took a lot of care in dusting off the variegated reasons why living humans would engage in the violent acts of disinterring human remains, robbing them, then actively forgetting those individual lives and histories, and culminating in their display as a show of power and supremacy under the respectable guise of science. And so by digging deep into this history, of course, he brings in the questions of how these remains came to populate not just the Smithsonian, but of course, several other museums in general, the Chicago's Field Museum, the Peabody Museum, the New York's Natural Museum, New York's American Museum of Natural History, etc. In short, Heaney's argument is centered on a surprisingly novel claim that Peruvian history matters for understanding the creation and development of Americanist anthropological collections for the period that he looks at. And that it's surprising, Chris notes that it's surprising that it should be novel, given how important this history was for the building of these collections. And that's something that is, as Alan was noting, is important for training of archaeologists, anthropologists today, for sure. So embedded within this argument, of course, are several nuanced and troubling problems, and Chris charts out with great care the deep historical roots of the traumatic power relations that are concealed by this curated display, and they continue to haunt us. And so this, the methodology of entanglement, I think, works very well because it's an entanglement not only that brings together the US consuls, the scientists, the anthropologists, but then also the people who were located, especially along the Peruvian coast, that made that engaged in the huaqueos and the robbing of these graves in order to make these bodies available. There's that level of entanglement, but there's an entanglement across time as well. And so it's kind of in that kind of historical narrative of being able to bring in also kind of this question of like how it was on the one hand, you have the Inca who had already tapped into this history of mummification for their own imperial ends, and then how that history then gets redeployed and re-narrated by later academics in order to make the Incas seem as if they were the settler colonials in some ways that then justify the scientific racism. So there's these layered upon layers of kind of how different imperial and how these bodies were kind of employed for these different imperial ends. And so, and of course, so not only were the Spanish chroniclers aware of and then wrote about the mummies that were these ancient, in order to understand kind of this Peruvian past, all these chroniclers, etc., they were translated, and of course these scientists were aware of it. So like that methodology of like being able to trace this temporal entanglement together with the geographic entanglement is something that allows for a very rich and nuanced understanding that is necessary to get at the complexity of the problems. And so, of course, with Peruvian independence, and this, I guess, is getting back to some of the questions that I'm really intrigued by and interested in. And the article, I think, addresses these questions a little to a point, but I'm assuming that the book is going to go deeper into those questions. But it's essentially because you do note how folks like Mariano Dardo Rivero and Jose Mariano Macedo considered Morton's findings bad science. And so I'm wondering, what findings did they put forward in Morton's stead, and for what ends ultimately? So we already know that so many different imperial uses were the Andean dead were put to these different imperial uses. Well, this is the fact that these folks were pushing against Morton, who ultimately became kind of the father of American anthropology. These folks were probably themselves trying to assume a role as the fathers of their own Peruvian anthropology. And I'm wondering to what extent, what findings did they put forward? Did their critiques ever get to the point of challenging the scientific cover given to the robbers of native tombs? And I assume not. Maybe, but I assume no. And what alternative uses did they put to the Andean dead in their narratives? And I wanted to know much more about that. And in that sense, and along a more contemporary line, I do appreciate so much your efforts to be explicit about your positionality with respect to the present of the Andean's dead's history. And I think that increasingly is such an important dimension to include in these historical narratives that are very much about trauma and these kinds of, and how the traumatic ways in which not only were these dead disinterred, displaced, both geographically and temporally, but then how difficult then it is to then place them in the context that would be healing, and how that in itself could also be traumatic in different ways for different populations. So I do appreciate that positionality, how difficult it is to do that. And although you say that you are not positioning yourself in a way that would narrate what should be done, nevertheless, there are some intriguing suggestions. And I was wondering if you could talk more about that, because at the same time that there are these questions of repatriation and Native communities, and how even in those cases, it's so difficult to be able to then bring in these ancestors in a way that can then be considered dangerous. I mean, that's one dynamic that's really difficult. But then also, what about Peruvian populations that are in the United States that are closer to the ancestors geographically? Like, all those questions become really interesting in terms of thinking through what the next steps should be. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Megan?
So thank you. First, I want to thank Jorge for inviting me. Thanks for your comments. And Courtney behind the scenes for all of her hard work. And especially want to thank Chris for giving us this really powerful piece to reflect on. So as I read Chris's article, which begins with and is named in reference to the exhibit at the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History, the skull wall, I couldn't help but think back to a talk by the current secretary of the Smithsonian Institution, Lonnie Bunch, which just took place here on campus a couple of weeks ago. Bunch described how he began his work of building the foundational collections needed to create Smithsonian's new National Museum of African American History and Culture. And again, and it was a powerful talk for everyone who managed to be there. Again, he described how people came to him wanting to donate objects to the museum. Some deeply personal family heirlooms, a shawl worn by Harriet Tubman, Nat Turner's Bible, shards of stained glass from the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in 1963. And when he talked about them, he was clearly moved by the experience, and I think it was moving for people listening to his talk. And several times during the talk, Bunch stated how humbled he was to be entrusted with these artifacts. And he said a few times, people trust the Smithsonian. I think he clearly conveyed that he was not taking that trust for granted, and that he knew that hard ongoing work is necessary to make the museum worthy of that trust. As Bunch is surely aware, and as Chris shows us in this AHR piece, the process through which the Smithsonian has acquired its objects of research and commemoration has not always been so attentive to the bonds created through exchange. Bunch's statement, people trust the Smithsonian, also struck me in particular because of my own past research, not on museum collections, but on the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute that, and it's, as of this year, a century-old field station at Barra Colorado Island in Panama. Like Chris's wall of Peruvian skulls, the station, known usually as BCI, came into the possession of the Smithsonian through the entanglement of US science and empire, and in particular through the piggybacking of US empire on previous colonial endeavors, in that case, both French and Spanish. BCI is a forested island in the middle of the Panama Canal. It's a byproduct of the canal's construction, essentially, and it was designated as a nature reserve and scientific research site in 1923 by the US-run Canal Zone government. It's been operated by the Smithsonian since 1946, and it's notable as the only branch of the Smithsonian that is based outside of US territory, at least since that territory was returned to Panama with the abolishment of the US Panama Canal Zone in 1979. The Smithsonian's collection of skulls and the Smithsonian's ecological field site in Panama share more in common with each other than might appear at first glance. And I was glad to think about my first book in relationship to your paper as I read it. I think comparing them suggests how the entanglement of colonialism and knowledge systems stretch well beyond the fields of physical anthropology and racial science. For one thing, both have been overlooked by historiographies of US scientific disciplines of anthropology, of ecology, that were written as if Latin America didn't matter in those histories. Likewise, like the Peruvian Indian skulls that Chris writes about, BCI became prominent in US ecology because it was so accessible through these colonial processes. Like them, BCI also came to represent a sampling of an ancient and natural American continent. BCI became the representative tropical rainforest for US ecologists. It was like the human remains Chris writes about, a portal to a pre-Columbian past. Early 20th century ecologists saw BCI as a sample of a pre-colonial American tropics, a phrase that they used basically to lay US intellectual claim over Latin American territory, even as they elided the very specific colonial and environmental history of that artificial island, and which included its historical depopulation. Like the human remains Chris writes about, whose overrepresentation in US collections gave scientists reason to make ever larger collections of Indigenous North American groups in a never-ending race for statistical rigor. BCI too became a model scientific site whose standards of control and the exclusion of local people born of that Canal Zone era was close to impossible to match at other sites, although many tried. But the cases of this field site and skull collection are also different in ways that I think also undermine Chris's argument about how histories and a living present of colonial entanglement complicate institutional efforts to decolonize. Craniology, after all, is a discredited science. While ecology has a really stellar public image, right? Ecology manages to hitch itself to positive images of environmentalism while also maintaining this burnished image of scientific neutrality. It's much easier for scientists to acknowledge the colonial roots of bad science, like craniology, than good science like ecology. Another difference, while the research value of some of these overabundant, quote unquote, overabundant, quote unquote, Peruvian skulls had become dubious, maybe even before Stephen Jay Gould's famous effort to use them as an object lesson in anti-racist scientific practice in the 80s. BCI and STRI's other stations are, in contrast, really essential ongoing research sites, right? So given that, what would decolonizing STRI look like? Smithsonian Cultural Research Institute. As I've written about, STRI officially became a joint Panamanian organization following the termination of the Canal Zone. And that took, as I've written about, pretty heroic efforts of scientific diplomacy in the 60s and 70s that distanced the institution from the US government, even as it continued to incorporate former US military sites into its constellation of research stations. And even though this was the era in which Global South critics of scientific extractivism coined the phrase scientific imperialism, STRI's leaders managed to leverage the considerable, not just national, but international public goodwill the Smithsonian continues to enjoy. So people do trust the Smithsonian. And this includes, at least from my experience, it includes Panamanians who, despite decades of exclusion, are also largely proud of STRI and of their country's outsized place in ecological science. Yet to this day, STRI only has one Panamanian director, has only had one Panamanian director, no longer does. The majority of PIs at the station, at their stations, continue to be foreign. It's hard not to see it as, despite major changes, a persistent slice of the old Canal Zone. As Chris vividly describes, the Smithsonian has taken part in rituals of the return of human remains, efforts, it seems, to purify itself of its troubled history, that in the end demonstrate just how entangled the politics of repatriation continue to be. In parallel, recently, there have been a spate of calls from within the field of ecology to decolonize their field. A process similar to what Alan was talking about, but much more recent in the field of ecology. Some of these amount to, I would say, rather modest calls for attention to DEI in ecological publication or institutions hiring. Others are far more radical, expressing in different forms the desire to interface with local or indigenous environmental knowledge. None, it seems notable in comparison with your case, have focused on the return of land or the repatriation of institutions operated by foreign organizations. Nor, in ways that your paper made me think about in a little bit more detail than I had in the past, is there really clamoring from host countries for this, which after all benefit from the infusions of cash and expertise that have historically come with those institutions. Now, many of these recent calls to decolonize ecology do explicitly recognize confronting a history of colonialism is important. Yet, I've noticed that they tend to engage with histories of colonialism at very broad global scales, acknowledging that colonialism happened. And maybe they seem to me to be kind of as a past to be overcome rather than a lived reality present in the very particular places where ecology works. The detailed histories of entanglement akin to what you write about. Chris's piece ends noting the lessons here are more ambiguous than we might want. And my suspicion is, and he has been asked during this session, that he's been asked what should be done with the collections of human remains that he writes about, as I've often been asked what lessons ecologists should take away from the history of their field station. And I think Chris states it best when he says that decolonization requires sharing authority after recognizing past entanglement and harm. And I think this first step largely remains to be taken, and it's not a one and done step, or not a direct route to trust. This first step, I think, must be taken over and over again. The step needs to be taken as many times as there are places and communities with histories like those that Chris traces. So I'll end there.
Please. Thank you. Thank you to colleague Jorge Cañizares Sierra for the invitation. Thank you to Chris Heaney for writing this thought-provoking piece in scholarly terms as well as in political and historical terms. And thank you to my colleagues for the thoughtful commentaries, which I got a lot, and thank you to you all for being here. So prior to my presentation, I want to say state three things first. First of all, I would like to acknowledge the Native American Indian and Indigenous peoples who are native to or have become part of these lands in Texas and the Southwest. Second, I would like to pay homage to the hundreds and hundreds of human remains, or better said, ancestors and ceremonial objects that are now in the institutional possession of the University of Texas at Austin. And third, I would like also to pay homage to the many indigenous people who have been assassinated by state agents in the recent months in Peru, in the context of a deep political, social, economic, and cultural crisis in the settler colonial state of Peru. So I would like to read what are, in a way, some commentaries in close dialogue with your article, as well as my own kind of further reflections after reading your article. So probably some of those notes are not strongly related to the main threads of your argument and your narrative. Writing about the collecting tradition of what she calls, quote unquote, imperial anthropology and the desecration of Native American remains and sacred objects, in her 2005 book, Recovering the Sacred, Anishinaabe thinker and activist Winona LaDuke states, perhaps it is an effort to cover an immense spiritual void inherited from its colonial past, and the mainstream culture has maintained and persistent tendency toward wanting to discover, classify, and collect everything the mainstream considers exotic in the United States. Descendants of settlers are, in a sense, haunted by nostalgia for the lost cultures. Then LaDuke adds, I quote, in attempting to dispel this burden, science has become instrumental, end of quotes. This question of the spiritual void of a settler society has also haunted me while reading the extremely insightful article on school walls by Christopher Heaney. More specifically, what LaDuke insightfully points out is to some extent linked to the issue in discussion in Heaney's article, namely the way in which the collecting of the skulls and remains of Peruvian ancestors by United States-based scholars is underlined by a quest to elevate American history, as Chris writes. Even though LaDuke is speaking from the local angle of the American Indian experience regarding settler colonial practices of collecting, her remarks on the questions of spiritual void and the phantasmatic nostalgia resulting from the colonial history on the settler scholar side couples well with the elaboration of Heaney on the endeavors of white American men of science, such as Morton or Barton. An additional note in this same line of thought that I would like to add is that it has always called my attention the fact that in many years interacting with scholars from this part of North America, the United States, who study indigenous Latin America and are part of the ideological, cultural, and institutional practice of Latin Americanism, they usually seem not to know that much or seem not to be interested at all in American Indian society's past and present. Clearly to me, this is the result of the epistemological and geopolitical institution of area studies and the way it frames the study of indigenous Latin America away from the indigenous lands, peoples, and lands away from the indigenous lands on which they work, study, and live. Is this another embodied example of how American scholars have this tendency toward wanting to discover, classify, and collect everything the mainstream considers exotic, as described by Winona LaDuke? The farthest from here, in this case geographically, the more fascinating it does become for them. And in the case of US-based indigenous Latin Americanism is perhaps another form to compensate a quote-unquote void in regard of their own American societal status. A final question that I would like to pose here is to consider to what extent there is a sort of also inter-imperial projection on the American desire to study the Inca death, which tends to reveal a high degree of admiration for the indigenous empire of what today is known as the indigenous Andean region of Latin America. As Christopher Heaney writes, I quote, Morton was sure that Peru's ancient branch, despite having heads so small and badly formed, possessed civilization, built monuments, and at least equals the Egyptians. In this respect, Morton then stated that most excites our admiration. In this respect, Morton then stated that most excites our admiration in the one must be also considered to the other. Indigenous empires have always been put by settler indigenista scholars and the mainstream discourse as samples of great civilizations. For example, we the Mapuche were and we are a polycephalic multi-territorial society. We never had something equivalent to a central state or imperial authority. Therefore, our predecessors never built monumental urban centers and no major stone-based monuments. So our burial sites are mostly wooden-based, based on wooden materials. So then very perishable. So the search for monumental solidity, permanence, and transcendence of imperial project was never part of our material and symbolic imagination and history. The monumental drive is so critical to empires that even it permeates the relationship to death and the status of the dead. Mummification becomes an instantiation of this scientific scale preservation like the Incas did, and it relates to a cultural sense of permanence and transcendence that is metonymical to the monumental enterprise of imperial societies. To what extent then to what extent then did all this make these American scholars and cranial collectors search for an ancient civilization? To what extent that would make them to invest in these sort of sites of imperial solidity and permanence that was not certainly available in other native lands, such as the Mapuche, the native Amazon, or going farther down southward in the indigenous Patagonia territories. Here is where fragility and perishability make many of us, the least civilized and monumental peoples, less interesting to pay attention to on the part of this type of white imperial scholar. Regarding the issue of collecting human remains in native North America by people like Morton or Barton, Chris Heaney stated that one of the two major reasons was a material reason. I quote Chris here regarding why native North America came up short for the collective interest of the American race science practitioners. I cite Chris's article now. The second material reason was that North Americans' wet climate made ancient remains particularly vulnerable to desiccation. Of this excavation, Jefferson noted that the skulls were so tender that they generally fell to pieces on being touched. Then, to what extent, that's my question, did this image of fragility and perishability lower the interest of people like Morton and Barton in regard to the native peoples of these very lands on which we work and study, and made them look southward on the hemisphere? Was it then that imperial civilizations like that of the Incas offered the solidity that an equally imperial science was searching for? To what extent was all this part of an imperial mirroring relationship between the white American North and the imperial Indian South America? Thank you. Shout to my glasses.
Thank you. Well, I don't want you to reply because we only have 20 more minutes, and there is a lot of people online and here might want to ask questions. So let's compile the questions and then you address them. Is that okay?
Yes.
All right, let's do that. So let's begin with Jeannie. Jeannie, it's been kind of online to participate and ask a question. So you can go online. You can activate your video. There you go.
Sure. Hi, this has been a great conversation. I appreciate it so much. It's I was looking forward to it, Chris, and you definitely delivered. So I'll just read the question that I've written. So it's a very basic question, and that is, where are the bodies, not the mummies, but the skeletons that the skulls belong to, and why were they not displayed as well? And I do understand that craniology was a specific field of study, and the primacy of skulls as a measure for in the service of genetics and in the service of tropes of white supremacy. But in other museums, in entre comillas, scientific settings, intact skeletons comprise part of the corpus, of the argument. So, why do you think this was? Was it a matter of further kind of separating the skulls' original owners from their corporal humanity to really make the skulls the object of subject and not the people that they had ever belonged to? Or was it just a practical matter of transporting evidence over a long distance? And then a question I have is, who separated the skulls from the bodies. Were they archaeologists or were they museum workers? And then I did add that I actually saw the wall of skulls on a family vacation when I was very little, but I was a very little kid, but it made quite an impression. I remember it still. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Question, the audience here? Yes, Glenn.
Yeah, I noticed that a few of you are using the language of settler colonialism, but in different ways. And I know that that's been a topic of like recent debate in American studies and in anthropology, and it comes into some like settler colonial studies can come into some dialogue with a larger body of colonial scholarship in Latin America. But I was wondering how applicable the like language of settler colonial studies you feel like is to this topic specifically, and to what extent settler colonial stuff, if you're applying the rubric of settler colonial studies to this case, to what extent does like the analysis of settler colonialism still apply when it moves into international contexts where it's no longer setting up a permanent settler?
Right. Anybody else? Yes, Erica?
Okay, I have a question for Chris, which is, his title is very evocative of the title of another book by Chris Thomas called Skull Wars, and he has skull walls. And so I just was wondering how, so he's kind of positing the architecture of kind of colonialism, dispossession, and decolonialism as ways in which to kind of enter this conversation. Whereas David Chris Thomas in that Skull Wars is talking about, you know, the progression of the field, et cetera. And so I just wondered how Chris kind of sees himself intervening with the kind of argument that Thomas is putting, which is a popular book. It's kind of, it's a very different kind of book than the kind of book Chris is writing. But I just kind of, I think Chris is doing something really smart with this title, and I wanted to give him an opportunity to kind of talk about that.
Talking about the Skull Wars, Cameron Strang, who was one of our own graduate students, a very good friend of yours, has a chapter on literal the Skull Wars, in which you have all these kind of cutting off heads of the Seminole and collecting them, send them to the Smithsonian, well, not the Smithsonian, but all the museums in the East Coast. The Smithsonian wasn't yet up, I guess, but that is part of that tradition of literal the execution of people and beheading them in order to do science. We should remember that as well in this piece. But my own question has more to do with your suggestion in the footnote, but it's not in the body of the essay, as to whether it was appropriate to dismount the mushroom cloud of skulls. That it would have been perhaps better to keep it as a reminder, daily reminder to all visitors of the Smithsonian about the racist roots of the sciences and the institution itself. Why do we tend to dismantle these things, to erase traces of our own history and to make us feel good at the time, but then erases evidence of who we actually are? So I think we have plenty of questions so far. Yes.
Hi everybody. It's very interesting to listen. I'm also from Peru, so that's a very interesting talk to me. I just wanna like to ask Chris if you can or if you can give us some connections with. I know that we were talking about like human remains, but also if we can talk about like the artifacts, the objects that for Andean cultures and also for Amazonian cultures, I do feel working in the Amazon area in Peru. So we know that the artifacts, the objects are also a charge of humanity for these societies, right? So we are talking here about human remains, but in other way, in the indigenous perspective, these objects are not just objects, are also human remains. So if you can give us like a comment about this and how can we extend this discussion to these other kind of materiality that also is in our discussion.
What was your name?
Carolina, I'm from the anthropology department.
I just wanted to piggyback on Jorge's question a little bit, and that at the Museum in Philly, there still is a skull wall. And the museum it's a medical history museum, but in a lot of ways, it's a museum for the grotesque as well. And you have shrunken heads and you have all of these other things in there. And sort of what I guess to what extent, right, how we cope with the fact some of these still exist, and how that's maybe a very different example than the one Jorge gives and the one you give, right? And that it really is just part of this still cabinet of curiosities place that's kind of in the basement of a old building downtown
This is a museum here in town?
in Philadelphia.
Oh, Philadelphia.
Got 13 minutes.
You have 2 minutes. You have 30 minutes, yes.
Thank you for the incredible questions. Thank you for the commentators for taking the time to engage. Also, and thank you, Courtney, for making all of this happen as well. I apologize for not thanking to begin with. There's a lot here, and I think two of the things that jump out and might be a way to answer a number of these questions in terms of sharing authority and thinking about what could be done in ways that are that include the possibilities of repatriation, but are also more inclusive of the intermediary stages of addressing history and making it manifest are there is the Smithsonian has Atahualpa's headdress. It is not actually Atahualpa's headdress. It's just labeled that in the mid-19th century. I refer to it briefly in the book. What it is actually is a shuar back headdress, a sort of that drapes over the body, and is made up of bones and beads there's a term of art for the coverings that go on over beetle wings, but sort of iridescent black and green, blue and purplish wings. And it is something that when it is a box, it appears very, very dead, appears it. I mean, it is laid out, it is in a box, much like the human remains in the Smithsonian. Maybe has been studied since it was reclassified in the mid-20th century as shuar, but I haven't seen anything written about it. But from what I've read about what it is like when it is worn, it makes noise, it shakes, it has a life of its own. You have to sort of think of it as a composite being in and of itself, and it's the number of monkeys that it took to make the bones, put it together, the number of beetles that it took. I can't say. I think one of the important steps is trying to figure out how to make these entangled histories visible and manifest without reproducing some of the violence that comes from leaving the skull wall up. And what, for me, Atahualpa's headdress does, it's also part of the story of how groups that weren't the Incas get flattened in the Inca story. If they're not monumental or imperial, they get collected in this 19th century moment in order to be Incas. And one thing to do is to talk about, that also leads towards art and life, and not necessarily just the human remains, but activates these lives of objects that are also subjects and have relationships to the living. And that can incite a conversation about, well, in addition to Atahualpa's headdress, that is not Atahualpa's headdress, but a shuar image of authority, there are the human remains that are behind it is really important. And Jorge, to your question, one of the ways that this piece went through so many revisions. Its first version was for the dissertation, but it went about 4 or 5 rounds of revision with the HR. And in one of them, I was a lot more explicit about like my reaction when finding the photograph, and I think it's still in the film, in the Smithsonian, but you know, I'm glad it's down. This strikes me, given the history that I know, as horrific. Ginny, I've been waiting for somebody to say that they'd seen it in person. I hadn't, and this is the first time. Thank you. Oh, you're silent. You're muted.
I was maybe 4 or 5 years old when I saw it, and I can still see it in my mind's eye. So, yeah.
One of my earliest memories is the gem room in the Smithsonian, and it was, I think, in 84, 85, 84, and so it was when it was still up. And so like there's like a ghost question that I have of like, did I see it and not understand it, or did my parents not take me towards it? And I think one of the things that is important is that museums are, you know, they're places of life, they're also places of death, they're also places of unseeing, and figuring out how to make that manifest in a way that allows the conversation, allows descendants to say, well, this is what we would like, without reproducing some of the harm, is important. And Jorge, I understand the impulse, and I think that one of the answers, I mean, Dan Hicks writes about this in the British museums, as he thinks of like performative repatriation as a way for museums now to like quickly deal with things, go through the motions, and not take responsibility for the continued relationship that comes from there being handfuls on the institution. And this is true in the Native North American context as well. And I really appreciate your points, which I take as also extending to, as somebody who began by working more on Latin American histories, for me needing to learn a lot more about Native American indigenous studies and history over the course of working on this. But it's not a uniform reaction to US museums. That's that the conclusion must be repatriation. There have been ceremonies to make ancestors comfortable or to reduce harm, but some communities, for them, it's not right. They say it's not right to handle them once again, and so figuring out, I think the Denver Museum is thinking about how to realize that part of the job in some cases is ownership and stewardship, or not ownership, but stewardship, in a way that the Native community still has a relationship to the institution, and that they're accountable, and that they're, you know, it's the thing that comes to mind. It's awful, but it also gets to Ginny's question of, you break it, you bought it, like you did this damage, and it is something that is going to continue to affect the museum. To that question, Ginny, a lot of the skulls were separated from their bodies at the graveside. Others became that way after their collection. This is a chapter in the book, but there are a lot fewer mummies that were collected in the 19th century than exist today. And part of that is because at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, when physical anthropology sort of reached a measuring peak, they were macerated. And this is one of the hardest things to talk about. They were approached as similar to other specimens, the animals, and reduced. And I think in some cases the bones weren't kept, but the skulls were, because that was a datum that the physical anthropologists were invested in. So there's also, and it was, I've found like the people tasked with doing that at the Smithsonian, Ginny, are Black Washingtonians, and they keep quitting the job. And so there is the collection isn't the only story. It's that there's a violence in the it's not stewardship, and I shouldn't be laughing. It's just in the curation that belies claims to sort of just neutral care and preservation. Yeah, there are many other questions on it. And
Briefly, the question that Lina brought up that I would like you to address, and it's a chapter in your books, which is an indigenous anthropologist from Wamanga. Wamanga, excuse me, who himself created and collected, etc., mummies and so forth, and created an alternative to modern and all the US anthropology of the 19th century that is worth remembering too. That is not that the other forms of collecting, I don't know whether it was violent in the case of Tello, they might have been the Peruvian anthropologist or not. It's not entirely clear whether he had connections with indigenous communities. But also the creation of alternative science of what to do with these remains, which is not the history of craniometry of the United States.
yes, thank you. It also, to connect it to Erica's question, which I'll just briefly answer as a way into it. In the 1980s, David Hurst Thomas participated in trying to take a lot of human remains. Took many of the indigenous human remains off display in the American Museum of Natural History. And one of the details that I found, I think it is also in the piece, is that apparently, or at least the way he still talks about it, is that Peru, unclear here as to does the embassy or not, asked them not to take the mummies off display. They are off display. Some of the Chilean, there's a Chilean miner who is on display still. And some of the pieces, the objects that came from the mummy, but also need to be on display. But that language of, this is our representative in the museum from like a Peruvian perspective, or at least from an official perspective by the government, is a way of thinking about Mariano Eduardo de Rivero and what he and Jose Mariano Macedo were insisting on as being as important, or if not more important than just the measurement of a skull. Objects, the antiquities that went alongside them, the culture, the language. Mariano Eduardo de Rivero is also in his translation into English in 1850 is the first time the word Malki or Malki appears in English to refer to the Huarochili Quechua, or not Huarochili, perhaps, but sorry, I'm blanking for a moment, but a term for a mummified dried ancestor. And so there is a unflattening that I think he is also, for Rivero is trying to participate in which he is saying enough talk about the Incas and about mummification as being needful of being like artificial to sort of have some nuance about other cultures. The Incas aren't everything, and he is interested in, and Stephanie Ganger's work is important in this sense of like looking at the other sciences that he was interested in and Andean resources. He's also interested in the question of colonial violence, and for Macedo, and this comes out more in my piece for ISIS, he's engaged with a Andean and Peruvian, and I hesitate to say subaltern because it was shared by many groups, narrative of who the dead were that was not scientific in the sense that these are pre-colonial remains or pre-colonial remains. There was a narrative that all of the human remains coming out of the ground, who were they on the coast? These were indigenous and Inca people who committed suicide rather than submit to colonization. And so it's a reading, it's an archaeology of who they were that was not saying, oh, these are past peoples, like in some deep past, but who represented resistance to violence. And Rivero doesn't believe in that, but he does talk about the human remains, imagining places like Chavin de Huantar and others as ancestors of the nation. And there's a way in which we talked about that historically in an appropriative sense, but when we get to Teo, he means it extremely literally. As a person who traces two lines of his family to two of the IUs of Huarochiri under the Incas. He's like, I'm a descendant. These are my community's remains. And this is a history that is not just Inca history, but the history of Huarochiri, the history of Paracas, that has peoples who aren't just imperial, but also of a variety of other cultures as well. And that's what, the book ends in that place because it's, for him, that's what collecting human remains also lets him do. It lets him argue with North American anthropologists whom he sees as polygenists, still believing in racial differences and races as essentially different species, to say that no, the questions are about culture, it's about knowledge, it's about Inca and pre-Inca people being better cranial surgeons than Europeans through the late 19th century. And I think one of the things, and I know we're going over time here, one of the things that, the reasons why I tend to not go in shoulds and think in shoulds, but think in examples. Some of the things that have happened over the last few years, there have been repatriations of human remains that are specifically human remains rather than, say, the Machu Picchu collection, which was mostly focused on objects. And several of them end up at Julio Teo's museum in Puerto Libre, where they join the other human remains that he understands as ancestors, and it's worthy of studying. And so, yeah, I'll leave it at that. There's a lot of questions. I think I actually did a fair amount of that. Megan, I'm sorry I didn't engage.
We are so disappointed. Well, on that note, thank you very much. Thank you, the audience. Next Monday, and congratulations to John, Jacob, for the publications. Thank you.